This video will discuss the culture of journalism and look at the values, ethics, and democracy within contemporary journalism. One of the foundational values in American journalism is the general belief that journalists should be neutral observers. Within this perspective, they mean that journalists really should just report the facts and just the facts, that they should not put themselves in the story, that they should not have any bias whatsoever, that they should neutrally, objectively report on what's going on and not insert any of their own opinion or bias. However, Herbert Gans has determined that there are four subjective values that affect news judgments, and subjectivity being, again, personal bias or opinions that somehow implicitly are shaping the news that we receive. The first subjective value is what's known as ethnocentrism. When we have ethnocentrism, we are basically looking upon and judging other cultures based on our own cultural perspective. What this means is when we do foreign correspondence and we're reporting on the news that are happening in a different culture from our own, we have the tendency, or journalists, American journalists, have the tendency to view that culture from an American cultural perspective, again, with the assumption that our cultural values are far superior than the cultural values that we are reporting on. The second subjective value is what's known as responsible capitalism. In this value, we see that journalists sometimes naively assume that business people compete with each other to increase prosperity for all. There's little critique of oligopolies, and we can stem this subjective value from the fact that journalism is very much a capitalist endeavor in today's day and age. Media corporations are set out to earn money and make dollars and not necessarily fulfill the higher or original intent of meeting the public's needs for news and information. So one of the problems that's inherent in this perspective is that journalists are very hesitant to go and critique any capitalist endeavors that might go against their mother corporations or the entities that own the news. The third subjective value we see affecting news judgments is what's called small-town pastoralism. What this means is that there's a favoritism in journalism for small versus large, rural versus city locations. We see this with respect to the demonizing perspective in which cities are typically reported on. So when we think of the news reporting on something happening in a city, we usually see cities as full of looters, full of crime, full of poor people, full of negative aspects about society. However, in contrast to this, we see journalists actually favoring small town communities. So in small town communities, you can leave your door unlocked at night because it's safe there, because everybody knows your name, because everybody wants to live there and all the people are very friendly. The realities of this are very much not in line with this subjective biased value. The fourth subjective value is what is known as individualism. Now, culturally speaking, individualism is a strong American value in general. So when the researcher Clifford Geertz conducted his study on cultural values across the globe, he noted which types of societies would value individualism versus collectivism. Individualism is this value where we see the culture values the individual over the community. So in America, that's very much in line with the ideas that you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, that you have to really just look out for yourself to ensure that you get ahead in life and you succeed. However, in collectivist societies, it's quite the opposite. In collectivist societies, the community values the community over the individual. So again, putting others before yourself, making sure that everyone in the community has everything that it needs before you tend to individual needs. That being said, we see, again, because Americans value individualism so much, so in Geertz's research, he showed that out of 73 different countries, the U.S. was #1 in individualism, meaning that more than any other culture, we valued individualism more than any other culture. We see this subjective value reflected in our journalism. We see this as journalists go out, and when they are doing the reporting, again, they're taking it from the perspective that it is the individual's responsibility to ensure that the individual succeeds in life. An example of this would be in reporting on welfare recipients. So when we talk about welfare as a national agenda, we don't typically see in news reporting the journalist addressing structural issues of welfare or welfare reform. Typically what we see is an instance of an individual who is abusing the system, and now that individual has become the case study for all recipients of welfare. Now, as consumers of the media look upon this depiction, they start to think that because of this one representation of this one individual, because again of this bias of individualism, we now think that all recipients of welfare are mooching or are creating loopholes or are swindling the hardworking taxpayers, instead of again trying to take the perspective that structurally there might be something more than just this one individual. Despite this research, however, reporters have traditionally aligned facts with an objective position and values with subjective feelings. However, with partisan cable channels popping up, they are now undermining reporters who try to report fairly. So for example, the fact that Fox News and MSNBC exist goes against this idea that reporters should be objective, that they should be unbiased, that they should just state the facts and just observe on the situation at hand. Instead, with Fox News and MSNBC, we see reporters blatantly asserting their opinions and their liberal or conservative bias and framing the news within that agenda. The suspicion of press bias stems from two beliefs that the public holds. So one, the public believes that reporters are out to get their subjects. So when journalists are out working with the public and trying to conduct interviews to support their stories, the public tends to think that the reporters are working against the interview subject's best interest and that they're essentially trying to frame their subject in a negative light. The second suspicion of press bias addresses that the press is too close to its subject, so quite the opposite of the first bias, where consumers believe that reporters are actually too close to their subjects, so maybe they're literally in bed with their subjects. So for example, there was a local reporter who was reporting on the Boston Red Sox. That was her beat. She was responsible for sports coverage of the Boston Red Sox. However, she was dating one of the baseball players. That ended up being a conflict of interest, and the reporter ended up getting reassigned to a different job because she literally was too close to her subject. Now, this actually supports the idea that the public views this of reporters in general. Examples like that one lead to the next topic of ethical predicaments. When journalists try to be objective reporters, that's not always a possibility for them. And so in some instances, they come across ethical predicaments, one of which being deploying deception. So when confronted with the idea of using deception to get a piece of information, journalists usually take one of two major ethical positions. The first one being an absolutist ethics. In this position, a journalist believes that the ends never justify the means. So at no point should you be lying to try and uncover a story or get a piece of information. On the other hand, the other ethical position would be situational ethics. This is where a journalist views the case at hand as an ethical decision on a case-by-case basis. So sometimes you might need to lie to uncover a really big story. An example of this would be Watergate. Woodward and Bernstein had to say a few lies to get at the larger story, which is that the president was doing something illegal. He was spying on the opposite party. That is a major scandal and ended up leading to Nixon's resignation. So when we look at these ethical predicaments of journalism, it's not always a black and white scenario. There very much is a gray area. There's also the problem of privacy invasion. Journalists often straddle a line between the public's right to know and the right to privacy. This is much more a harder situation for celebrities and people in the limelight because they are seen as people who have more information that the public wants to know. So that leads more into the public's right to know scenario, where if the public are interested in the story and they want the information, then it's okay that the journalist invade the privacy of a celebrity. However, for individual people, everyday citizens like yourself and me, we are afforded much more privacy than somebody who might be a celebrity, because there's so much value placed on our right to privacy, and everyday citizens are willing to sue journalists to protect that freedom. Lastly, I want to talk about balancing story conflict. Balance means presenting all sides of an issue without appearing to favor any position. Now again, this correlates directly with that objectivity perspective of journalism, where the journalist should be reporting just the facts and not inserting any bias or personal opinion. However, certain problems are presented when trying to create balance within a story. First and foremost is time and space constraints. Journalists aren't always given all the time they need to fully develop a balanced story. So making sure that they provide enough balance to each side of the story to seem fair and unbiased. The other one is space constraints. So thinking in terms of a newspaper, you might only have one column that you're allowed to provide information in, or in broadcasting, you might only have 30 seconds to get your point across. That means with editing, you're going to have to edit out a lot of information, which again could lead to an unbalanced story. Another problem is the misrepresentation of the complexity of social issues. Because of these time and space constraints and because of the editing process, we're getting a much more watered down version of news and information that again is leading to a misrepresentation, or potentially leading to a misrepresentation. Journalists can't possibly provide all of the facts and detail of every given story within their very restricted and limited format. So because of that, again, they can't fully develop the complexity of social issues. A third problem is that journalists claim neutrality, which makes them appear value-free, but as we've discussed throughout this video, that's not necessarily true. There are inherent biases as human beings, and there are subjective values that are placed within news stories either intentionally or unintentionally. The last problem addresses a narrative function conflict. In this conflict, we see journalists who are trying to balance the drama of the story with fair reporting of the story. So this is much more a problem with broadcast journalism, where if it bleeds, it leads, and the television medium is asking and demanding for a more entertaining way to present news and information in and of itself. And so by its very nature, it is already trying to engage with the more dramatic elements of a story rather than a balanced story or fair and objective reporting.